it made sense for the Great Century of Missions from late 1700s to 1910 that we created agencies that sent people from the West to the rest. Made some level of sense. But I don't even think anybody thinks that way anymore. Mission is from everywhere to everywhere, including everyone.
Welcome to the Lausanne Movement Podcast, where we have a passion to accelerate global mission together. If you like today's episode, won't you take a moment to rate and review our podcast and subscribe? That way you won't miss a thing. And now, for today's interview. Well, Dr. Ed Stetzer, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Ed, it's a pleasure to have you with us today. Many of our listeners are passionate about the global church and about global mission. And the moment someone makes the decision to step beyond their local church or their local community and begin mission outside of their borders, there's an increase on complexity in navigating cultures, navigating trends, and navigating relationships and various institutions. And you've been in the world of mission for many, many years. And so I'm hoping today from our conversation, we can draw from some of your experience, that we can learn from some of your insights that would enable those who are listening to more easily navigate the complexity of both local and global mission. But before we get into all of that, I would love to kick us off by just hearing a bit about your backstory. One thing I know about Ed Stetzer is that he is passionate about the local church and building up the bride of Christ, as well as missiology. And so could you just share with us where that passion, where those passions came from and how they developed in your life?
Well, I guess just you kind of do your backstory. You start where you were born. I was born just outside of New York City. My family are kind of very rooted, very connected New Yorkers, Irish Catholic, but nominally Irish Catholic. And I came to Christ in just a series of personal crises and kind of youth group age. My mother had just recently become a Christian. So I didn't come from a Christian family. She had just recently become a Christian. And then she forced me, I got in trouble. So she grounded me to go to a Christian thing. And I heard the gospel. Well, but pretty early on, I was interested in how people engaged one another. Coming from a New York non-Christian home, came to Christ in Florida, which was a little more rural at the time. Now it's much more booming. And then I went to school in Georgia, or rural Georgia, Northwest Georgia. I kind of found myself probably culturally mismatched, this New York kid in all these places. And I wanted to know more why that is. Why are people different? Why do they think differently? And then Donna and I felt the call to plant a church in the inner city of Buffalo, New York, among the urban poor. Now, we have listeners around the world here on Lausanne, but Buffalo at the time was the fastest shrinking city in America on the front page of all the newspapers because of crime. It was the middle of something called the crack epidemic of the late 80s, early 90s. And so we stepped into that situation, and I didn't have any theological training. I went to a Christian school that was sort of moving away from being a Christian school, so I took 2 religion courses. My undergraduate degree is in biology and chemistry. But in my denominational tradition, it's not a very robust ordination process. So we just went. I got a job as a contractor, building stuff, renovating stuff, and planted a church. Well, while I was there, I realized a few things. Man, I didn't know my theology. I didn't know my Bible well enough. So I went and started getting some education. So I earned a couple of master's degrees while I was in Buffalo. And then, really began to find myself drawn toward understanding people more. So I loved evangelism. And if evangelism is telling people about Jesus, maybe missions is understanding them before we tell them. And so I spent more time leaning onto the mission side. So eventually went down the road from Buffalo to Erie, Pennsylvania, planted another church, 2 daughter churches out of that. So I was very much involved in church planning, which of course is a missions-focused activity. There did a doctor of ministry. And then I got a phone call from a leader a pastor in my denomination, wanted me to jointly appoint me to become a church planting professor. The ink was still wet on my doctor of ministry at the time. While I was there, I really wanted to go deeper into missiology. So I did a PhD in missiology while I was a professor at the school. And so I kind of, by that point, education kind of had led me to the place where I'm a missiologist who helps people understand our cultural moment. I'm primarily helping pastors and church leaders engage cultural moment, sometimes missionaries, but primarily more pastors and church leaders, because I think having a mission mentality in our cultural moment is important. And now I I just recently became the dean of the Talbot School of Theology here at Biola University. It's the 5th largest multi-denominational seminary in the world. And we're just now merging in the Cook School for Intercultural Studies so we can have a greater focus and a sharpened focus on missions and cross-cultural missions at the Talbot School of Theology as well. So I left out a lot of things. Left out my awesome 3 daughters. I left out like places we lived along the way, but nobody wants to hear my life story that much.
Well, I disagree. I think we would all be interested in hearing the inner workings of what goes on with Ed Stetzer. Thank you for sharing a bit about that. We've had a few professors from Biola already on the podcast, and so it almost feels like we're advertising your university. So Dr. Alan Ye and Common Arms.
Well, thank you for doing that. It's a great school. Have I mentioned it's the 5th largest multi-denominational seminary in the world? I'm sorry, I just had to mention that again.
Wonderful.
And programs are available now. All right, I'll stop. You can edit all that
There
out.
you go. Shameless plug. You're welcome.
There you go. I love serving here.
Yeah, and hearing about your fascination with and your interest in what's happening within culture really for me frames how I've seen you over the years. I've been able to follow some of your podcasts and read some of your books. And Ed, you've always seemed to have a strong intuition about where things are heading. And I'm not sure how they might frame that within your circles, but my more charismatic friends might describe it as prophetic. But in this case, I just call it intuition. As you're focusing in on culture, as you're trying to understand what's going on in the world, you've often spoken into where your culture is going, especially in the States. And so I'm keen to unpack some of your insights and your thoughts around how things are shifting within missions. To begin, I would like to maybe look at the past. You've been a reflected practitioner of mission for decades. Looking back, were there any pressing issues that you advocated for, let's say 20 years ago or 10 years ago, that you no longer advocate? I'd imagine for some reason, maybe it's not necessary to advocate for them anymore, but maybe you've advocated and you realized, oh, maybe I was a bit off there, I was a bit wrong, and you've reorientated. Could you share any of those insights with us?
Oh, all the places I've been wrong. I guess I could take hours sharing all the places I've been wrong. But I think your bigger question is like, what would we advocate for then that we don't advocate for now? I think one of the things you have to acknowledge is that, well, in the West, it's not true in the same way in Brazil. It's not true in the same way in the Philippines. But, most of my work is in English, so I translate another language. But in the English-speaking Western world, I think the culture certainly has changed in some pretty substantive ways. And I think if you miss that the part of what it means to be discerning is to be like the people of Issachar, who discerned the times and knew therein what they should do. So 20 years ago, churches were having internal battles, methodology. For example, the worship wars were raging 30 years ago. I was asked to speak, first time of several times I was asked to speak at the Southern Baptist Conventions, the largest Protestant denomination in America. And I was the first person to speak from a main stage setting. And this sounds so, blasé today, but I said, I'm not going to wear a suit and tie, and I'm going to sit on a stool while I preach. And they were like, well, you can't. If you sit in a stool, they won't be, you'll be seated too low. And I said, well, I'll just have to adjust. Well, they didn't, but I did it anyway. And so what I said was, I was sort of making a point, because the prior year, a very prominent pastor in the denomination preached against pastors sitting on stools and wearing Hawaiian shirts. Actually preached, called it out as wrong and sinful. And so I sat on a stool and wore a Hawaiian shirt. Not much, just a tame Hawaiian shirt. And I said, from this very pulpit, we've preached out a whole generation of young, innovative pastors because they did things differently. And that was what I communicated. Now, that was a pretty major, not a non-controversial issue. I looked around the room at that convention meeting, 2007, and I said, I come here to the Southern Baptist Convention every year and I had a smile on my face, but I said, it's the one place that makes me feel young and thin every year. And so, people laughed and then were like, hey, and they invited me back, I think, next year or the year after. So it wasn't, but the point is, they were fighting wars about methodology and internal methodology. Well, now the vast majority of those churches have kind of adopted the very thing that they probably criticized 20, 30 years ago. So the worship wars have kind of passed in most of traditional evangelicalism. And nobody went back and said, hey, I'd like to apologize for preaching against Hawaiian shirts and sitting on stools. Nobody went back and did that. But I think what's happened is there was a shift where Christian faith and practice was inside of mainstream culture. And there's a chart that I've kind of put up. And one of the things that happened is that in the 70s, Christian identification was a mainstream thing. And, in the 70s, it might have been 80+% of Americans identify as Christians. Most of them weren't active or practicing, but you had convictional Christians and congregationally loosely connected Christians, and you had cultural Christians, and they made up 85% of the culture. And then there was this sort of cultural gap between them and the secular world. So, the most hated woman in America in the 70s, I think this was on cover of Time or one of those magazines, was a woman named Madeline Murray O'Hair. She was a very famous atheist who wanted to get prayer out of the schools, the most hated woman in America. Well, I can tell you that, atheism now is pretty mainstream. Like, we have TV hosts that are, and comedians and politicians that could all be atheists. It's a little harder to be a politician as an atheist, but matter of fact, when Bernie Sanders, one of our presidential contenders, was running, he would be careful not to say he's an atheist, but didn't believe in God. So it's kind of like how he would carefully sort of navigate that. But now what's kind of shifted is the secular percentage is much higher. People who are culturally Christians now have views that are more aligned with secular people. People who are congregationally Christian, Christmas and Easter, their views are more aligned with secular people. So what's happened is now the gap, the chasm in culture, right, is actually between convictional Christians and the rest of culture. So whereas before, I don't know, there was like this umbrella of vague Christianishness. I know that's a strange term, but Christianishness, and that's gone now. So to be a Orthodox Christian who believes Christian things can be a scandal in our world today. So what I would say is maybe the worship wars aren't the highest priority anymore when you're actually you're outside of mainstream culture, where people in mainstream culture actually think you're a threat to the rest of culture and more. So I think that's happened. It's happened in different places. It's different in California than it was in Chicago, where I lived before, or Tennessee, where I lived before that. So it's not like one thing. There's not like one year or years you can say this happened, because where I grew up in New York, it's been pretty secular, and Christians have been outside of the mainstream culture for a long time. But I think that's probably, I would have spent much more time telling Christians how to carefully engage the culture in 1997. And today, I would say that you still need to think about how to engage the culture and be kind to people. Being winsome, it's not a mission strategy, it's the way of Jesus. So you ought to be kind and winsome to other people. But you ought to recognize that you're starting at a different point. You're a convictional minority in a world that often sees you as a threat.
So, if you had to stand on a stage, like the Southern Baptist Convention, for instance, an example, not necessarily this convention, and you had to almost give a similar speech to what you gave 20 years ago when you sat on with your Hawaiian shirt on the bench, what would you do? How would you give that same presentation today in a way that would be as effective as it was back then?
Well, see, Southern Baptist Convention is tricky because the Southern Baptist Convention is a denomination that's perpetually at war with itself. So it's a little bit different. And I don't think a denomination perpetually at war with itself can actually continue to find paths forward. So I would probably say some things about maybe you should find enough things to cooperate upon and then doctrinal statement and find ways to move forward and to work together. But so would say, because I speak at lots of other denominations. So let's not, the SBC and the TCA are in unique moments of struggle inside their own denomination about the kind of denominations they want to be. So, but in general, what I'm talking to Christians about today is how to engage a cultural moment that's less open to the cause of the gospel. That, a lot of our ideas about being attractional, we can, if we make it better, we sped up the music, we spiced up the sermons, and we spruced up the buildings, and a lot of boomers came back and a lot of Gen Xers came back. And so I'm not like mad at the people who did those things, but I think now not addressing hard topics, for example, at my church, we did a series recently called On the Table. And we just say, here are the biggest questions people have about you might have, and people have in our culture. And it's about, why do bad things happen to good people? That's the message I preached. A Mariners Church is the church. I'm a teaching pastor there. But then there were messages on sexuality in general. There were a whole message on homosexuality, on transgender questions and people. And, I think that in 2024, now, again, this is key because I recognize every culture, this is one cultural expression. But in 2024 in California, clarity is kindness. Well, I think it's probably true everywhere. But so we're pretty upfront with what we believe, but we're still carry on that kind of welcoming place for people who have questions, have spiritual questions. We're still, if you use the term seeker, if someone would say, I want to check out the faith. Well, in 2024, they got questions about what Christians believe about some of the issues that we just talked about, the exclusivity of Christ, the authority of the Bible. So I think that I would encourage people to take those steps. So for me, when I have a talk, I talk about kind of our post-COVID reality. I think a lot of churches were impacted in pretty big ways. And the two things I say coming out of that are that you need to elevate your ecclesiology, be clear who you are as a church, why that matters, and you need to engage the mission. So those are, I call my 2 E's. Elevate your ecclesiology, because one of the things I think that happened during COVID and the years of tumult that followed, we found out a lot of people were being discipled by their cable news choices, and they were being spiritually shaped by their social media. So we want them to elevate their ecclesiology, to be all in their church, to be in biblical community with one another, not loose bonds, but deeper bonds to their church, and then to engage the mission. It's never a bad time, but now's a great time to say, how do we engage all God's people in God's mission? And, joining Jesus in what he's doing in the world, walking in the power of the Holy Spirit and doing what he's doing in the world.
Yeah, so you've already mentioned and you've given practical steps with elevating ecclesiology. How do you encourage, what practical steps would you give when you're speaking about engaging in mission, talking about a local church? This is a missions podcast. How would a local church within your own cultural moments, what would that look like for you? And you say, okay, so we want you to be more missional. What would you say would be the next steps for them? And say, okay, we want to be missional. What would that look like?
I mean, ultimately, I think to get a vision for the kingdom of God, how the kingdom has broken into this world, how we're citizens of that kingdom, how we're working towards the prayer that we pray, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. I think taking John Stott, of course, John Stott and Billy Graham, the two founders of Lausanne, Stott would talk about mission more broadly. I tend to agree that the mission is broad. I think it was Avery Willis who said that mission is joining God in everything he's inviting Christians to join him in the world. So I want to set a table that you would do kingdom work for the mission because you see yourself as having heard the words of Jesus, as the Father has sent me, even so I am sending you. So now you're living sent in your context, whether you're working at a bank or driving a truck or a homemaker or a student. So I would say a vision for the kingdom of God. Second, kind of a clear sense of my place and my role in the mission. And then ultimately how that connects to the local church, which also could connect to global missions and more. I think those are good places to start. But I think it would be unfair to say that, well, that 2-minute answer is everything. I mean, just keep in mind that all over there are good resources on how to increase your mission engagement as a church, both mission locally and globally.
Wonderful. So as you look ahead, what trends do you predict will shape the next 2 decades of Christian mission?
Well, it's where. So, if you're talking about Africa, I'd love to see, as Africa continues to become the globe's Christian continent, I'd love to see Africans engage in cross-cultural missions in ways that have thus far started, but not been seen the level that they could be. Imagine if the global South, which may be, socioeconomically probably had far advanced more than where the West was when the Great Century Missions took place from the late 1700s through the 1800s. What if the global South said, we're going to take the gospel to the rest of the world? I stood on a beach in João Pessoa, which is kind of the tip of Brazil that points to Africa, the farthest point, the closest to Africa, with 10,000 Brazilians stretching out our hands, praying for God to send a group of missionaries to the harvest around the world. So I'd love to see, and I believe we will see, we already see parts of that in some places I can't mention, but churches around the world who are taking up that global mission mandate. So I hope we'll see that. I think we really don't know what the next few years holds. I think, if you would have said, we had this interview like 5 years ago, we had these, what people call black swan events. We had this COVID that shut down so much of the world. But then it's not just that, and then the rise of nationalism in nations and countries and sometimes shocking political candidates who become political leaders. And then we have a war in Europe. We've got, war in the Middle East, which could escalate at any moment. Either of them could. We're all kind of waiting for a war in China. So we're at a place that 5 years ago, I think we'd all be pretty surprised that we're in. So I would be very careful to make predictions. But in general, I think we could expect in 2024 more, not less, tumult and turbulence. These things come in cycles. They do tend to calm down. We don't always go through that. But we've had a pretty strong lull, Pax Americana, where kind of, decline of the Soviet Union as a superpower, and then, a few decades of relative, if you were in Iraq, you didn't feel that way, or hundreds of other places. But I think that is probably coming to an end, and those are tumultuous and turbulent times. And what that looks like, I don't know. But I think ultimately, for Christians in general, I think we can always prepare by leaning into 2,000 years of church history, 2,000 years of Christians who've navigated difficult and tumultuous and turbulent times. And if that's our lot, then you don't get to pick the time you were born. And I really might at times miss the 1990s, but we're not living there anymore. And so we want to be faithful to the mission and the time that Jesus has sent us to.
Well, you answered one of the questions that I had for you next, which is how you would propose the church actually responds to the tumultuous time that we live in. And I think reflecting back on the church and its history is actually a really powerful way to do that. I think of Augustine and how he had to deal with the whole fall of the Roman Empire. Must have been a very difficult time for them as believers to process the changing dynamics of the global scene. And so very helpful.
And let me mention that too. So Augustine writes City of God after the eternal city has fallen. So people forget, and he was perhaps the most influential theologian for a millennia. So I think the reality is, I recently sat in I know most of our listeners are not American, but you maybe have seen at some point a picture of where they give the State of the Union speech every year. The American president doesn't have to, but generally gives a speech. And in that, there's that room where the House normally meets. The House is in our legislature. And so on the day that it all sort of went bad in the leadership, there wasn't a Speaker of the House, which was unprecedented. People were shouting at each other. The members of the House were leaving the floor. We were supposed to meet there for a briefing on something I can't go into detail, but on the floor of the House. We weren't even sure we were going to get to be in there, but those people left yelling, and we eventually got in there. At that moment, there's no Speaker of the House, which is unprecedented. There's no path forward to this. Our government right now is quite divided. And I sat during the State of the Union speech, where the Joint Chiefs of Staff, those are our military leaders, key leaders of the different branches of the military. And I sat there in that spot. And I don't know if it was a word from the Lord, but it was impressed upon me. There's no promise that this endures. And, for Americans who've always thought of themselves as one solitary governmental structure for centuries, though, again, that leaves out a whole lot of history before that and more. The promise is that the church, the gates of hell will not prevail against the church. And so I think people who, when the British Empire 100 years ago, who are now not at a very different space, or people who were in the Empire of Portugal and Brazil and more. I mean, these are all things so I don't know that we have a promise that this will endure. I do think, therefore, it is wise us for wise governance, but to also make our primary allegiance to the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, whose kingdom is not of this world.
I think that's really helpful. And I think that leads to a question that I had for you later in the interview, but I'd like to bring it forward now. And it's got to do with the relationship between the US church and the global church. You've already mentioned the shifting landscape of global Christianity, with Africa being the epicenter of Christian movement for the next few decades. With all these shifts and the decline within the US church, how do you perceive the role of the North American church or the US church evolving in light of the worldwide Christian movements? And what are the implications with the US-based ministries and their approach to global missions?
Well, and let me address the first question and maybe demur on the second question, because I don't know that I want to get on a podcast with Lausanne and tell all the heads of mission agencies in America what they should do. I have done that. If you're interested, I was asked to give a talk at Missio Nexus, and I talked about the decline of the Western Mission Agency and the rise of actually the local church's engagement, and what national indigenous mission agencies look like as well. So I'm not unspoken on the topic, but let me just tell you how, since I'm the Lausanne regional leader for North America, which it sounds much more impressive than it is. It's not. It's just I'm here to help, and I do other people's directions and directives. I think that maybe you'll give a picture. We had our gathering in New York City during COVID, no less, and we brought in people from around the world to kind of work towards and plan L4 in the meeting itself in Seoul. And so it was in North America. So my job was to bring greetings, and you need to know, people will be listening, and there's angst about North America and the United States in particular globally. And I get it. I wish I could just apologize for the prosperity gospel that we've exported around the world that's undermined so much orthodoxy, or even some of the divisions, or our inability to address issues within our own movement that you have done around the world, or even this idea maybe we should give up the label evangelical when so many of you are thriving under that label evangelical, as if Americans are the ones who get to decide what the word evangelical means. So what I did is I got up, and everyone it was interesting because everyone's trying to coach me. Well, Ed, make sure you say this, make sure you say that. I said, I'm actually good. Let me just share. So I got up and I said, I recognize that the United States in particular, North America in general, and the West, and we tend to have an outsized influence. That's just factual. If you look at the best-selling Christian books in Africa, most of them are by American authors. And I don't think that that's a good thing. I think I would like to see more African authors being read by African Christians. But I said, so as far as Lausanne go, I can't fix all that. I can collectively say, I wish it were not so. But here with Lausanne, we don't want to be the choir director. We want to be a voice in the chorus. So we're going to join our voices with people from other nations and regions and people groups and ethno-linguistic people groups and more. So that's the posture that I'm trying to take, is that in America, so in American culture, there's like levels of, like, when you go overseas, like, this person's really American. And often that's kind of built around what part, like if they're urban or if they're Northeastern, or at the peak of like really like American, they're New Yorkers. And that's me. So like I am all of those things. Now, I hope we live in a world, we talk about this at Lausanne, where we're going to honor people from different cultures and different contexts. And I come from a specific culture and context that people who've been listening to this podcast surely have picked up by now. So I thought it was good for me, being a New Yorker, in a meeting gathered for planning L4 in New York, to just say what's in the room. We don't want to be the choir director. We don't think we'd be, we think we unqualified to be the state of American evangelicalism, for me to get up and say we're going to be the choir director. And we want to learn from what God's doing in the majority world. We want to learn from what God's doing in the global South and more. To do that, we have to adopt a posture where sometimes maybe we're used to being more upfront and in charge, and instead we're going to be not the choir director, but a member of the choir. And I would tell you too, it's interesting because even, I'm an evangelical, probably use the term conservative evangelical to describe myself. But even as we're having some of the splits in American denominations around issues of orthodoxy, around, well, a myriad of different issues, I want to say sometimes, can we just listen to our global South sisters and brothers? They seem to be holding orthodoxy, and you say you want to listen to them, but you're moving away from where they are on orthodoxy. So all kinds of things we can learn, I think, from our global sisters and brothers. And again, we're not that we're voiceless, we're a voice in the choir. We get to have a seat at the table, but it's not our table as in North America's table, it's our table as in the movement.
I love the way that you articulated the way the Lausanne movement tries to bring people together, and the humility to be able to say, okay, we're no longer leading the choir. We don't want to lead the choir. We want to be a part of the choir, and we want to add our voice to the beauty of the global church. And that's certainly what we're trying to achieve through Lausanne. So Ed, one of the things that I was really keen to unpack with you, you've been involved in multiple organizations, different levels of missions and ministries. I'm thinking of your local church experience. I'm thinking about your involvement with missions organizations like Lausanne. I'm even thinking about your tertiary education and your role as professor in all these different institutions. As I've navigated these different organizations, there's often a complex relationship between all of these institutions. And I would be curious to hear how you understand the roles of all of these. And so I would like to begin maybe with just the global ministries and local churches. How do you understand the role of the local church in the context of global mission? And likewise, how do you understand the role of global ministries within the context of the local church? And where do you often see them missing each other? And what practical steps could we take to build stronger partnerships with each other?
Okay, that's 5 questions. So let me try to unpack them one at a time. I was one day driving across one of our more rural states in the United States. And I think I was driving from Alabama, where I landed in Birmingham, to a little church in Mississippi. And I was getting to this church because they were donating a van to our little church plant in Buffalo. And I drove into this little town in Mississippi. And then there was by this little, I don't know, it might have even been a dirt road, but it was certainly a narrow road. Went over a bridge, was 1 lane. But to get into this church, they were giving us a van. We needed the van in Buffalo. I was going to drive it back. But it wasn't this church. But before I got to this church, I came by this little church. I'm guessing sat 50 people, maybe. I mean, I could see the brick building. It's a little country brick building. And the sign was huge. The sign almost looked bigger than the church. And it was so long ago, I should have written this down. I would remember it more clearly. But it said something on the sign like Pentecostal World Outreach Center. And I loved it because they're right. So that little Pentecostal church in rural Mississippi, whose sign may be bigger than the seating in the church, saw themselves as a Pentecostal World Outreach Center. So what I would say is it's an odd thing. Jesus gives the Great Commission to the church. If you notice when he says, Matthew 18, all authority has been given to me in heaven and earth. Go therefore, make disciples of all nations, baptizing them. So that gives us a clue. It's to the church, because the church does baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. The church does the teaching to observe all I commanded you. So the Great Commission is given to the church. So if the Great Commission is given to the church, what then is the church to do? So literally, the Pentecostal World Outreach Center in rural Mississippi has been told by Jesus to go therefore make disciples of all nations. Well, how can they do that? Well, they can't alone. So what happens is the Great Commission necessitates cooperation and associationalism. So we cooperate and we associate with others in order to accomplish that Great Commission. Now, that church could send somebody. I mean, we can go back and we see pictures of that where people, the Moravians, sent out 1/10 of their people. So they could send out, a little church of 50 could send out, maybe households, maybe one household would go out and do that. But the problem is what we found in 2,000 years of missions history is we need some training. We need to understand cross-cultural realities. We need some support systems. One pastor would say famously to one missionary, you go and I'll hold the ropes. So we need people to hold the ropes. So that's where those ropes kind of connect us together. So what happens is that local churches all around the world, so in Africa and in South America and in Russia, and in Southeast Asia, all around the world are given the Great Commission. They have to find ways to partner together to accomplish that Great Commission. And then they collaborate, in ways that advance it. Now, it gets a little tricky sometimes because, Pentecostals and Presbyterians, they both love Jesus and they both believe in being born again by the power of the gospel, but they're going to plant churches that are probably different and probably in their own denominational families. So for me, I think the role of the local church. Now, this was my talk at Missio Nexus. What's happened in America and in other places in the world as well, particularly in places like Korea, places where large churches have taken root, like Brazil, some places, well, Africa certainly, but where large churches have become, and that's a relatively new phenomenon at this scale, is they themselves take on mission agency-like attributes. And this is part of what I talked about in the Missio Nexus thing. So I think that some of the key future players are actually local churches, and that's led to a declining influence of some mission agencies. Now, not by declining, I don't mean like Cru is still the probably most influential mission agency and the largest in the world, as if you define them as a mission agency, which I think can and should. The Southern Baptists have the largest denominational missions force. You got YWAM, you got all this sort of stuff. But now, a lot of times it's a local church that's engaged in this as well. And it's been a struggle for the mission agencies because what's happened is these little devices that we hold in our hands have flattened everything. Whereas a century ago, you would set a boat out of the harbor and you'd go take a box with all your possessions and you go to, far, far away lands. And now it's an airplane trip. You keep in touch via FaceTime. So with the flattening of that, it's not all good because what happens is, particularly because so much of the money is in America for these mission endeavors, the mission agency that gets the best funding in India is often the mission agency with a leader who can best relate to the Americans. And that's not a solid missiological strategy long term. Again, not that it's not bad to relate to one another, but you get my point. So I think we're kind of in a scramble for what are the new patterns and processes. And I'm working with a couple of folks who want to invest in church planning. And I'm trying to, what would it look like to, for example, resource indigenous national church planting movements? So for example, depending how you count, the largest mission sending nation in the world, certainly the US, but you get to number 2 and 3, it's confusing because it's like, do you count people who are sending out people to plant churches among their own people who are in a diaspora? Think in terms of the Korean diaspora. Do you count people in India who are sending people to plant churches among ethno-linguistic people groups that are 30 kilometers away, but it's a different ethno-linguistic people group, religious background and more? Is that cross-cultural missions? Of course it is. So it gets a little confusing. So I think we're still not quite sure what the end result will be, this kind of re-scrambling of our mission strategies. It made sense for the Great Century of Missions from late 1700s to 1910 that we created agencies that sent people from the West to the rest. Made some level of sense. But I don't even think anybody thinks that way anymore. Mission is from everywhere to everywhere, including everyone. And who's the follower of Jesus? And I think that's part of the Lausanne gathering. Why I'm excited about being in Seoul for L4 is there are people who are sending missionaries in and around the world. Some of them even send missionaries to the US. And I want to see more, not less of that. I know you do as well.
Well, one of the fascinating things about the State of the Great Commission report is the finding that the US does send out the most missionaries, but they also receive the most missionaries than any other country, which is a fascinating shift.
Well, but here's the thing where it's tricky. You got to figure out then, how do you count diaspora missions, right? So you probably know that the United States has more ethno-linguistic diversity in it than any country in the world. It's not the most diverse country in the world, but there are more ethno-linguistic people groups in the United States than any country in the world. And if some of them already had a robust Christian population, like Brazil does, and by the 20 years, Brazil will probably be more evangelical than the United States. And Brazilian mission agencies or churches send people to gather their Christians that already exist in the United States into churches or Brazilian churches. I'm not against that. And I mentioned the Korean diaspora as well. The wonderful Nigerian church here and here and here. What does it look like, though, to engage in that cross-cultural endeavor? Because typically, you might find American mission agencies, not all, but typically don't count sending American missionaries to pastor American expat churches in other countries to be missions in the traditional sense. It's called an international church. So if I'm sending a missionary, it tends to be someone who's crossing cultural boundary, maybe some geography as well, to engage a people with the message of the gospel that is not already. But again, this is where the lines get blurry. You get that, but that's part of the challenge of even how we count those things.
Yeah, and I suppose the other question that comes to my mind is, what does it look like for those diaspora churches and missionaries to partner with, for instance, in this example, the US churches? Just building upon what you've been speaking about throughout this podcast interview, you mentioned again and again the need for partnership, the need for collaboration. And so I would love to hear from you. In your mind, what opportunities are there for collaborative partnerships? And what advice would you give to mission leaders or church leaders in building and sustaining fruitful partnerships with each other?
Yeah, and partnership and mission is complicated. We have far more examples of failure than success. Issues of dependency. I mean, just Google the Nevius principles and how their partnership actually led to kind of a slowing of the work in Korea until they rethought it, and then the Nevius principles put into place. So this is a huge thing, and this is all in the missiological literature. So if you're not a participant in the Evangelical Mission Society, missiological society, getting involved, stuff like that's good. Reading mission journals is good. Missiology, the Journal of Evangelical Missiological Society, EMQ, those are good. Because I think there was an acknowledgement that how easy it is for non-discerning Westerners to give money in such a way that it actually undermined the work or caused problems with the work. Back to the Nevius principles, they called the people who became Christians rice Christians because they became Christians for the rice. And they would then hire them as evangelists. Okay, great, you're a new Christian. Let's just hire you as an evangelist. And so Nevius said that when we did this, we just slowed the work of the gospel. So he created the Nevius principles, which said, no, a person is to stay in the work that he's in. We shouldn't, be paying converts for the work of the ministry and more. So then that became kind of the thing. We shouldn't do that for 100 years. And then people are like, and there were some voices in Africa saying, we see partnership as different. We want partnership and relationship that's there. And there were some wonderful, very well-known articles that sort of push back on some of the Western idea now of is we don't give you too much to hurt you. And they're like, well, we want to, let's collaborate and have partnership together. So what I would say is there are as many ways to do partnerships as there are people groups that we're engaging. And you should read. There's this famous story of a bicycle and how it divided a mission and et cetera, et cetera. Someone gave a bicycle and how it really caused more harm than good. And so you should read those things. And I think that mission leaders should not rush in where they have not thought about the cross-cultural dynamics and the socioeconomic dynamics that are at work there. It is too large of a chasm to just jump in and not think through these things. But I would say I don't know that there's one way to do that. I think, my church is engaged partners in the Northeast Desert area. That's the particularly unreached people with tribes that are unreached in Brazil. And we work through a local partner who knew the situation, who's kind of aware of some of the cultural dynamics. And then we sent a missionary family and they engaged into this area. So we went through a process. We could have done it more quickly, but we did it more wisely. And I think when it comes to partnership, doing it more wisely is better than doing it more quickly.
Yeah, and I think the tension when it comes to partnership is that it is a lot slower to do what you want to do, right? So the moment we decide to collaborate together, we have to have a relational dynamic, we have to build trust, and that slows the process down. But at the end of the day, we hope that it'll lead to stronger mission and stronger ministries to be formed. Dr. Stetzer, you've already mentioned that you work with Biola, and you probably work with a lot of youngsters who are passionate, have a fire in their belly.
They don't like it when you call them youngsters, but that's probably true.
Yeah, they have a fire in their belly. They're keen to get out onto the field. They're keen to do ministry. What pieces of advice would you give to younger leaders who are listening to this podcast?
Yeah, so one of the things I love about Biola, I don't work with Biola, I work at Biola. So yeah, they're my boss. I volunteer for Lausanne. One of the things I love about Biola is it kind of smells like the Great Commission here. You may be aware that at the end of the 1800s, beginning of the 1900s, there was the student volunteer movement, and then there were the student missionary unions that birthed up hundreds of campuses, primarily in the Western world, but hundreds of campuses. They call them student missionary unions, and their theme was the evangelization of the world in this generation. And And they were at all the schools, not just the Christian ones, the Harvards, the University of Chicago's, all these different schools. And they wanted to get the gospel to the nations in their lifetime, the evangelization of the world in this generation. Well, part of the reality is that waned over time. That passion waned over time. And there's actually now only one student missionary union that traces its organizational connection all the way back to that beginning of those SMUs, student missionary unions, back in the early part of the last century. And only one continues this and now runs the largest annual student-led missions conference in the world, and it's at Biola University. So it's kind of fun to be at the place that continues to have the only remaining SMU from that time. There are certainly things that have birthed, but a continuous chain and to have that. So for me, my experience is a little different and probably unique in that I'm at a school that really highly values the Great Commission. So we have students who will come and want to get engaged and involved. I said a meeting yesterday. We've got initiatives on the arts and missions and launching some more things around that. And I've got another meeting later about, missions to Muslim contexts. And so it's a big driving thing. What I would say in general is, I think that the interest in, I'm going to be the person who gets a degree, maybe an undergraduate degree in blank, and then maybe get a seminary degree in missions, has probably waned, and people are thinking of different ways to go into missions. And I think that's good. But I would say as you're thinking about going into missions, right now, more people are going to the NGO route. I want to serve the poor. I want to serve the marginalized. And I say, thank God, let's have more, not less people doing that. But I also want to say that if we don't also prioritize the engagement of the unengaged, unreached people groups in the world, I think we're missing out part of the heart of God, that we might go to every tongue and every tribe and every nation. So that Revelation 7 vision would be true. So what I would say is pray through. If you're young and you have the freedom to do this, pray through, Lord, what might I do to let the nations be glad? Let all the nations hear the good news of the gospel around the globe, so that the name and fame of Jesus might be praised and worshiped in every name among every people group.
Well, Dr. Stetzer, we're going to have to bring the podcast to a close. Before we do, any last words that you'd like to leave with our podcast audience?
Well, no, super great. I think it's great. Thanks for having me on. And I would say that, I think that a lot of mission groups and agencies are talking about 2033 as the 2000th anniversary of the Great Commission, and wanting to complete the Great Commission, by which they mean getting the gospel to every ethno-linguistic people group in the world. What a great rallying cry. And you might say, well, is it really the 2000th anniversary of the Great Commission? Probably not, but maybe worry less about that. And let's mobilize and motivate people towards the Great Commission, because I think we could see a great harvest. So we have a lot of resources in the Christian world. Let's get the word out to those who've never heard the name of Jesus, so that his name and fame would be more widely known.
So good. Dr. Stetzer, where can people connect with you online or find out more about you?
EdStetzer.com. Pretty easy to find. STETZER and EdStetzer.com.
Wonderful. I'll be sure to put that in the show notes. Dr. Stetzer, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for bringing what you could bring to this podcast and sharing insights that you could share. And so blessings to you, and thank you for all that you do for the kingdom.
Thank you much.